So just before we get into today's episode of Powerview, I want to bring things back to one of our earlier episodes. Jordan and I spoke about the purpose or goal of the Realist Idealists and its subsequent podcast series. For anyone who hasn't seen that episode, the Realist Idealists is all about trying to get a better understanding of how and why our world is the way it is. That on its own is important enough, but we eventually want to take that a step further and utilize this better understanding for why our societies are the way they are, to be able to have a meaningful conversation for how we can make our world an even better place. When I first pitched this idea to Jordan, I drew upon the fact that Jordan and I have a diverse degree of knowledge. There are many channels out there that focus on similar things to what we speak about on this channel, but it is our ability to bring these ideas together that will ultimately make a difference. It has been my personal belief that the more we understand about our world, the more it will ultimately shape our perspective on life. We also spoke on the format of the Realist Idealists as a channel, with there being 3 main podcast series that we plan to produce. The first, of course, as you already know, is Powerview, which has been our politics and economics series on this channel. I'm excited to announce that we will be starting to release episodes of our second podcast series on the Realist Idealist channel. Continuing with the theme of bringing ideas together, this will be a history-focused series which aims to show how there is often a series of decisions and/or events that lead up to why our world is the way it is. So, be sure to keep your notifications on for the first episode of The Catalyst. And with that being said, let's get into today's episode. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Powerview. On today's episode, we will be discussing the difference between economics and the economy. I'm Braden, he's Jordan, and together we are the Realist Idealists. And this is Powerview. So, we're going to start today's episode off with just a general, simple definition of economics versus the economy, right? And again, I'm not going to use any formal definitions that you're going to see in a textbook. So, Jordan, you can, of course, jump in and add to it. But in, I guess, as simple as I could kind of boil things down, the economy is essentially all of the goods and services that are produced, and then you could argue, you could extrapolate that to the value of those goods and services, right? In specifically a given region, right? So you can have that as small of a region as possible or large as a region as possible, right? You could have everything from a town or a city to a country or a continent or even the whole world, right? The global economy. That essentially, again, is right. You're looking at the products that are products and services, or goods and services, I should say, that are created in a given region, right? Yeah. In terms of economics, that's really the systems or extenuating factors that facilitate trade. So again, you're still looking at trade in both scenarios, but economics is really how that trade is kind of comes about, right? So actually, you know what? I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Does that make sense, Jordan? Like, in terms of economics is really how we facilitate trade, right? Whether it be
it's how you go
all
about
the different systems.
Trade.
Yes, yeah.
What's the word? It's like your method of doing business almost.
Yeah. So there's lots of different ways, exactly, right? That trade happens. And there's also, I guess, with the economics side of things, is all the extenuating factors. So something like taxes affect the economic system, or the availability, kind of supply and demand, things that play into to that,
certain
right?
resources. Yeah,
But it's both. In both cases, one kind of determines the value, and the other one is the products that are being valued, right? So
yeah.
the economy are the products that are being valued. The economics, I would make the argument, is how we value those products, right?
Yeah.
And again, in both cases, you're looking at a given region. So it can be as big or small as you want. But when you're looking at the economics of Oakville, Ontario versus the economics of Canada,
yeah, you can look at like a county, or in our case a region, or like versus a province, and then that versus the national.
Yes. Yeah.
And then that versus like
the globe,
geographic, so like North America, so like US, Canada, Mexico versus like Europe.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you can even compartmentalize those down into smaller,
so it really just depends on what you're looking at, but those are kind of the two, if you boil everything down, right? One's the system, the other's the actual products, right?
Products, yeah.
So if we're going to kind of go a little bit further with all that and go into a little bit more detail, I want to go through some of the types of economies, or I guess conversely, you could say the types of kind of economic systems that go with that. But really, I would say it's also the types of economies, right? So there's 4 in particular that I think most people would focus on. I guess you could have something in between there, but 4 major ones that kind of cover everything. And that's traditional, planned/command, market, and mixed economies.
Mixed, yeah.
And so traditional, as you can probably imagine, is kind of your traditional, like basic format. It's really where you have a limited amount of products that are being produced. So you'll see this in very rural areas, very tribal societies.
Think less technology, like agricultural based kind of stuff.
Their focus is really on how can I produce the basic necessities of life, given the fact that we have a scarcity of resources, right? So their only real focus, there is still trade. So you might have the barter system, which we've talked about previously in some episodes. But they really are just looking at, hey, we don't want diversity of our goods and services. We're just trying to have an economy that focuses on how do we get by in life.
The basic necessities.
Those basic necessities. Kind of going from there, which is getting into kind of, I guess, more to our modern day look of different economies. But we have a planned/command system, right? What that really entails is you have a centralized authority that governs all of the economy. So what goods are produced, who gets to buy and sell those goods, what's the value of those goods, like what are they bought and sold for, all of those different aspects of control, I guess. Hence the like command/planned economy aspect of it. That is all done at a centralized level. So often you're looking at governments, but it could be, in theory, other entities. An example, or a few examples of that, and this is, again, where I think a lot of people look at a command or planned economy and think of it as a negative thing, because a lot of the examples are kind of awful examples in some ways. But if you looked at something like Nazi Germany, communist Cuba, the USSR,
North Korea.
North Korea, like Mussolini's Italy, like those, any country where the government controls essentially 100% of how the trade occurs in the country, and who gets access to what, and what's created in the first place. That's really a planned/command economy, right? That all makes sense to you, Jordan? Okay.
Yep.
Kind of the other side of the coin is a market economy. So this is the type of system where I think the vast majority of us would be the most familiar with, because it's what a lot of us have in our own countries. But you hear something called like the free market. So that's where individuals are essentially one, determining what the value of goods are. So again, looking at supply and demand, all of those kind of factors. So the value of goods is one thing, but also what is produced in the first place. So that kind of goes hand in hand, right? You're only going to produce, or ideally you're trying to produce things that are valuable. You're not going to just produce something that has no value. But it's society as a whole is going to determine what that value is and if you should even produce it in the first place, right? So it's not a government or, Jordan, I know not necessarily this time around, but you had mentioned like a monarchy being like a centralized power.
Well, yeah, because you could use, it could just like, and it's, excuse me.
Yeah, no worries.
It's not the system of government; it's how that system of government like uses its applies its economics in a way.
Yeah. You could have a democratic planned economy or command economy, but you could also have a more authoritarian type of regime. In theory, like a monarchy that has more of a market system where it's still society gets to choose what's produced and how it's valued, but they kick it all. There's a kickback to the top, right? So the government itself, or the type of government, really doesn't necessarily determine one thing or another, even though I know in the case of our command/planned examples, it tend to be more authoritarian type regimes. But in theory, you could have a more democratic approach to those same types of economies. But nevertheless, a market system, it's especially in a free market system, that's what most of us are very familiar with. If you have a product A here, there is a certain amount of supply and demand based off of that, and then that's what determines the value of that good, right?
Yeah.
Or I should say, our final economic system is really, or economy, I guess, is a better way to phrase this, is a mixed economy. And what that really entails is kind of a hybrid approach of both a planned,
which is common.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh no, it's most developed nations will use like that, some kind of degree of like a mixed system.
Yeah, I would say that if you looked at like socialist capitalist systems, right? So that the reason why I add that socialist aspect in there is, so for a long time, for instance, in the United States, it would be hard to say that they were a mixed system, right? Now you can make an argument that there is a bit of that, but Canada would be a better example. I think the UK has a little bit more of that. Some of the Scandinavian countries have that. Sorry, what?
Yeah, those are probably. I was gonna say those ones are probably even the better examples.
Yeah, exactly. So really, what you're looking at with a mixed economy is that, again, it's that hybrid approach where you have some goods and services that are completely controlled by the free market. So us as individuals, whether we want to buy and sell these goods, is really what determines their value, versus the things like maybe pharmaceuticals or energy, those prices or the value of those things, regardless of supply and demand.
Yeah, certain foodstuffs, like we know here, like the government has to regulate dairy to some degree.
That would be a good example of. It's not always, I guess, straight from the economic system. Sometimes it's maybe. I was going to say NAFTA, but whatever, the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, whatever.
Yeah, it's NAFTA. Yeah, it's NAFTA.
Like that controls how much dairy is exported from the different countries, right?
Versus imported.
Yeah, right. So that's I guess a little bit more of a export trade side of the economic system, versus if you were looking at more of like a domestic situation, right, where drug prices, like what Canadians pay for insulin. The reason why we pay so much less than the United States is because the Canadian government negotiates with the company that makes insulin on the price of that drug, right? Versus in the United States, it's completely free market with that. If there's enough demand, which there obviously is, insulin is probably, I would make the argument, is probably one of the most popular. Popular is maybe a weird way to phrase it, but it's probably the most sought after, common requirement for people to live their lives. If you have diabetes or other insulin deficient diagnoses, not to get all medical here, but nevertheless, though those types of things, you can have it where the government, in Canada's case, controls and negotiates on our behalf what we're going to pay for those goods, rather than the market telling that company, hey, you can charge $100 for this versus you can charge $400 for this, right?
Yeah.
And you can go down the list. It tends to be, I would say, in a mixed economy, it's those essential goods, right? So energy, medical, sometimes you might see, like you mentioned with dairy, like food stuff, housing, like if you have government housing versus just the like free market like housing. Again, you might have like the housing one's almost a good example where it's not the housing industry as a whole that's regulated, but there is
aspects.
Sorry, what was that?
Sorry, no, it's not as a whole. It's just like certain parts of it, but not.
Yeah, right. Like they have government housing that's controlled, or you could make the argument of like rent. If you have a system where the rent is controlled, aka like rent controlled regions. I, as a person who owns rental property, can only increase the rent by a certain amount, regardless of the amount of demand that is there. There might be people knocking on my door trying to get into this rental unit, but I can only increase the value of this by X amount.
So much, yeah.
Right? So yeah, there is kind of, I think mixed economies tend to be some of the more interesting in some ways, because it is that hybrid approach where government is stepping in some ways, and then you have other parts of just kind of the free market.
Let it kind of, especially if it's not like an important commodity in that
sense,
right?
Right? Like if, I don't know, video games, right? Like, something like that, where it's just...
Yeah, even though it's a massive industry, but it's not like essential, so...
Yeah, right?
They kind of just leave it to do its own thing, right?
Yeah. Your luxuries, like you said there, right? You can kind of... A lot of luxuries tend to be in a market/mixed economy. Those are where the free reign is, but then those basic necessities are where we're going to have to focus on. Okay, government might step in. But you also have countries, like I mentioned, the United States, that don't do that, right? That don't regulate, or they regulate things in different, not like the cost or like price of things. It might be like a carbon tax. You can make the argument is regulation, or like you can't dump your toxic waste into a river type of situation. That's obviously regulation, but that's not regulation on price. That's not regulation.
It can also depend too on like availability of stuff. So they might regulate lumber if like supply of lumber is strict, but if the supply of lumber is not strict, they might not really regulate it as much because they're not too worried about it's flowing, so you don't need to worry about the supply not being there.
Yeah, that's a really great point. That sometimes it's a temporary measure that becomes like a mixed economy. Whereas
or the commodity just becomes not important anymore, so like it just doesn't get regulated anymore, kind of thing.
Sure. Like let's say we advance into the future and we have the equivalent of like an arc reactor that like energy is just endless supply. Well, it doesn't really matter that government has their hand in it because energy's unlimited.
Pick your energy supplier.
It's essentially free, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's all coming from the same stuff. It's just dyed different colors. That's all it is. Yeah.
Too funny. But yeah, hopefully that kind of between, obviously, your traditional is a little bit more of that kind of on its own where resources are scarce. It's really just focused on those basic necessities of life. And then your planned in and market, those are really the kind of two sides of the coin. And then mix is the whole coin, where you can have a hybrid approach where government steps in to control certain things, whereas the rest of the goods and services that are produced in a given economy are just free reign from how much money and how much demand is there, right?
Yeah.
Based off of supply.
Like, I'm sure when we were growing up, Pokemon cards made up a small percentage of the GDP here.
I'm sure in many countries of the world, Pokemon cards made up part of the GDP.
Yeah, but obviously that changes with time, right?
So there's a good example, though. The GDP of... I apologize if I'm wrong on this, but isn't Pokemon Japanese, correct?
Yeah.
I was going to say, I was like, am I wrong in that? But yeah, so the GDP of Japan, part of their GDP would be the exporting of something like Pokemon cards and Pokemon as like the TV shows and all that stuff. So the value that they got out of that product contributes to, I think I didn't necessarily mention it in this recording, but the GDP, right? Gross domestic product, right?
Yeah.
That's the value of goods and services within a given region that were sold, right? Or to a degree produced.
And it's like we're saying, like you can look at that at like a city size level, or like a county or province, and then up.
The economy of Ontario is very different than the economy of Saskatchewan. But if you're looking at the economy of Canada, well, the economy of Saskatchewan and Ontario, as well as everywhere else in this country, are all kind of come together to give a value, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I know we've, maybe it was quick, maybe it wasn't, but I know that was a somewhat quick synopsis. The only other thing that you can maybe add into there I don't want to go too deep into this because it's their own kind of conversations, but like capitalism, of course, is an economic system, right? So you can have capitalism technically in a planned economy. You can have capitalism in a market economy. The way that they differ is that you still can have, like, this is where, again, it's a little bit of an asterisk because most people would say you're not really having capitalism in a planned economy, but you could have where a government controls what is produced, but the citizens pay for it on a capitalist level, where it's like a supply and demand aspect of, okay, the value of this, but the government decides, hey, this is the TVs that are out there. These are the TVs that are produced. That's a random example, but you know what I mean? These are the TVs that are produced. And then the market, from a more capitalist scenario, is going to decide, hey, this is the value of it, and we're going to pay for it that way. But yeah, obviously from economic systems, a communist system is an economic system. Capitalism is an economic system. The barter system is an economic system, right? It's how we facilitate trade, going back to that original kind of definition, right?
Yeah.
So again, I know we've kind of ripped through those relatively quickly, but I think for a lot of people, they have a general idea, and hopefully this just maybe cleared some things out and didn't confuse you more. That's always my hope, that I haven't confused people more. But I guess going off of that, and this is where I kind of want the conversation to go, is really looking at, why do those things matter? Why am I even telling you all this at the end of the day, right? What's the point of understanding the difference between an economic system versus an economy, right? And I mean, I know I've talked a lot, Stuart. I don't know if you want to automatically take a stab at that and try to give your idea of why those things are important, or if not, I can of course kind of give a bit of a jumping off point for our conversation here.
If you want to take the lead, and then I'll see what we're going to go with.
So,
because I'm thinking of a few things, but
for sure.
So, yeah.
I think you can look at this for a few different reasons of why this is always important. But one, if we're just looking at the economy, right? and just focusing on that definition, we often hear in the news or politicians or anything like that talking about the strength of the economy, right? Whether it's doing poorly or it's, the economy is doing great, we're rolling, everything's good. Or you can have another situation like in kind of this post-pandemic world where we're talking about, the economy is struggling a bit to keep up with demand because we had all these products not being produced, right? In any one of those scenarios, when people talk about the economy, it's talked about in a very general sense, right? So the economy might be doing well, but that doesn't mean that you as an individual are necessarily doing well, right? It could mean that the GDP for the country, let's say, is massive, right? Like, let's say from a year-over-year perspective, it's gone up, 20%, right? It's like a large amount, which is very, very uncommon. But let's just say, hypothetically, that happens. Or I should say, at least in a developed nation. I don't know if that's even the right term anymore, but nevertheless, in a developed nation, it's not very common to have a big jump, but let's just say it is. That might be really great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have increased by that 20%. It may mean that a certain industry is propping up that the economy, right, in our GDP. So I think energy...
It doesn't give you a full picture in that sense.
Sorry, yeah, I cut you off. Do you mind repeating what you just said?
Oh yeah, no, it was just like it doesn't give you a full picture in that sense of.
Yeah, I think kind of going piggybacking off of that. When people talk about the economy, they are talking it at more of a macro level, and not to be a little bit more of an economist with this, but they're looking at it as like, how is the country doing, or how is the province doing, rather than how are everyday citizens doing, right? So it's not a clear picture of how your life is doing. It's maybe a clear picture of how the tax income for a given area is maybe increasing or decreasing, right? Because we all know from our tax episodes, the more goods and services that are produced and sold obviously mean more tax revenue that's going to come in, right? Yeah. So it might give you a sense of, hey, the government's budget might be a little bit higher this year because the GDP is a lot stronger, or we don't have as much of a deficit because of that. But that doesn't necessarily change how your individual life is. So if you're not necessarily in one of those industries that are booming, right? Let's say the energy industry is doing really well, but I don't know. I was going to say maybe like farming, for instance, is not, right? Agriculture.
Something else that's being supported and kind of controlled through.
Right? So you have all these basket of goods and resources.
Well, they did it. What was it with automotive? Was it 2008?
Yeah. Yep. When the bailouts had to happen for.
Yeah. You take from one area, and it's.
Yes.
It's the old saying: "You borrow from Peter to give to Paul."
Yeah, there you go. Right. So yeah, you might have, and I think that actually is a good example in some ways, because that is a situation where the auto industry was doing really bad, which then caused the economy to do poorly, really right? Bad. But that doesn't mean that you, let's say you're in, I don't know, in the tech industry, you could have done super well for yourself, right? And you're like rolling in the dough as a business and as an individual. So you have nothing really, because you as an individual, you really are one piece of that puzzle when it comes to the economy. It doesn't give you a good representation of how your life is, right? Even the consumer price index, you can make the argument of, hey, the value of certain things, like because of inflation, has gone up, but
Yeah, it doesn't mean people are making more.
Yeah, or it could mean that you made more. Like, so maybe you are in a situation where inflation is at 7%, 11%, but you were in an industry that made 20% this past year. So, yeah, sure, things are more expensive, but your lifestyle, if anything, has increased, right? Regardless of that inflation, right? And you can have, again, in all the scenarios that we're given here, you can have a situation where it's the opposite, right? You can have an economy that's doing well and you are in the gutter versus an economy that's doing horribly and you're at the top, right? So yeah, I just, again, focusing on that little nutshell of just the economy, not looking at the economics necessarily. I think that's where it's really important to really understand when you hear about things in the news or politicians talking about these things. You do have to somewhat question it relative to your own life, but also even what they're actually talking about, right? Like when the economy is doing well, but it's actually one industry that's doing well, right? Is that something to brag about as much as it is?
Well, yeah, if everyone's complaining about the cost of everything and you hear they're saying it's, you know what I mean? You kind of got to take it with a grain of salt in that sense. Because, like, you're talking to your neighbors, like, oh, this has been so expensive. Like, this has been so expensive, and that's been so expensive. We're like, yeah, but the economy's doing great. We're like, is it then?
Yeah, right?
Because if everybody's paying more,
yeah,
but not making more, then it's like, it's certain areas are doing great that benefit some people, sure.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that that's a good segue in some ways to kind of why is it important in terms of understanding economics and economic systems and all that, because you run into these scenarios where the economy is doing good, but you might be paying more for things. You might be, right? Like all these other factors. And that really gets back to the actual system, right? Again, reminder that economics really, really focuses on the actual system versus the actual products of that system. So yeah, understanding the different economic systems, regardless of their different types, right? We talked about communism versus capitalism. We talked about, like, again, very loosely, but like planned versus market, mixed, right? All those different things.
Yeah.
There are pros and cons to all of those, right? Obviously in Canada, our medical stuff is controlled by the government. People complain about those things all the time, right? So there's pros and cons with that, right? If you had a private system versus a public system for healthcare, maybe, depending on where you are in life financially, a private system might be better for you. Maybe you're getting care at a better rate, right? A more efficient rate, because you could pay for that. So yeah, there's all of these different elements of the pros and cons. Obviously, a pro would be the drug prices, right? Regardless of who you are, a government that gets to control that, it's probably going to be a better situation because they have a larger purchasing power, right?
Correct.
So it doesn't matter really what economic system you look at. It's more importantly, like, again, for the most part, you can look at the individual pros and cons from a situational level, but hopefully, and again, it's hard without going into like actual examples and all that kind of stuff, but hopefully you can kind of extrapolate from all this conversation that the ability for success or the potential for success and overall growth in an economy can be achieved no matter what the economic system is. Now, the economic system has to adapt with the times, right? Like if you have like you were talking about where the economy is doing great, but we're paying more, right? Which is really our world right now with inflation.
Yeah.
How the government deals with inflation is the economics of our economy, right? How the banking system works, how taxes work, how all that kind of stuff. That's the economics of it. If you don't manage those things properly, then obviously the economy can crumble based off of those economics. but there's
especially when you get so dependent on like
but if the
one or two industries,
central banks did a better job regulating that rate of inflation, right? If we, again, I don't want to go into all these things, but if they didn't just give out a bunch of money during the pandemic to just random things, right? Like not even stuff that are going to produce anything, you could have been in the exact same economy that we're in now, and arguably the exact same economic system where we have it's capitalism, it's a mixed economy, right? Like all that kind of stuff, but a different result could come out of that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, hopefully that again makes sense. I don't know, Jordan, if you have any questions with that, but really the economics question is a question of recognizing that you're told that this is the only way that we can do things, but that's really not true, right? Like, and I'm not trying to promote one way or the other, right? Like some people in the United States say that free market capitalism always is the best choice, whereas some people would make the argument of having our mixed system works really great because you can have some things that are very profitable and others that are important we control.
Or
right?
an entire another way that no one's come up with
100%. Yeah. Right? Yeah, right? Like whatever that may be. But the real importance of economics is getting down to the nitty-gritty of why something is valued the way it is, right? Even in communist like USSR, like Russia, you know what I mean, right? Even in that conglomerate of states during the USSR's reign, there was still value to the goods that they were like buying and selling, right? If you wanted to buy a loaf of bread, it had a value. It wasn't just simply like, okay, here's a better way to look at it. Even if you have, here's a voucher for a free loaf of bread, right? I'm not exactly sure how like food stamps type of situation was in communist Russia, but let's just say it was a system where it's like, okay, I have a loaf of bread coupon, I give that to my local grocer or bakery, and they give me a loaf of bread, right?
Yeah.
That loaf of bread, even in a system that doesn't have money, doesn't have a monetary value where you can be like, that was $3 or whatever. It still has, like, the economics of it still determines what the value is, right? So that's supply and demand, and all those kind of factors that play into things still is going to determine how much bread can one individual get, right? Like in our, obviously, a more modern context of Canada or the United States or anywhere in the world for that matter, if I have X amount of dollars, like based off of my job, I could buy whatever loaf of bread I want, versus someone else is like, okay, I can only afford the cheap stuff to be able to meet my budget, right? So in all the different economic systems, you can have different results that play out, right? It's kind of like what we talked about in some other episodes with like democracy, where you can have a democracy that works really well, and you can have a democracy that doesn't work very well, right?
We've seen both examples.
Right? Like I think a lot of us don't think our democracies are working great right now, but I think that there's been times where we all feel that democracies have been the greatest thing ever, right?
Yeah.
And I think that same argument, right? Jordan, you're my history buff. Laissez-faire capitalism in like England and the United Kingdom. What is that? 1800s? What is that?
It was like French Revolutionary times, I guess.
Okay, sure. So,
like, you could say it started before, but it was kind of after the American Revolution that it kind of got popular. Like,
okay, so obviously, laissez-faire capitalism. Again, I'm using a term that maybe we haven't really talked about, but that's this idea of there are zero restraints, right? That's going back to our market economy, where
Yes, in a way we have, but yes,
yeah, where there's zero regulation from government, right? So if I'm an owner of goods and resources and there is demand for it, so therefore I will charge whatever I want, right?
yeah,
At the end of the day, that's a market system, that's capitalism, that's all of these things. But I mean, history has shown that that system does not work. It's not sustainable. Some people get very rich, but the rest of society is very poor, which I guess kind of harps back or brings back to this idea of you can have a really strong economy, which obviously laissez-faire capitalism in the UK and France and places like around the world, arguably the kind of the start of the industrial era for manufacturing goods and stuff like that. The economies were very strong, but the average like lifestyle, or what's the word I'm looking for? The average
standard
thank
of
you.
living,
Yeah,
maybe?
no, that's exactly what I was looking for. I was like, why am I blanking on this? But yeah, the average standard of living was a lot lower, right? Because you only have or even that at that, even when you take the average, it's almost skewed, right? Because sure, 99% are like pretty poor, but that 1% brings up that average a little bit more because they're also included in the economy, right? And that's why you have situations where it's not always so clear cut in both scenarios of, hey, is this economic system working? Is our economy actually as good as we're saying it is? And I guess everything in between that kind of goes with that, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if there's other things that you wanted to touch upon with any of those things. Again, we didn't go into the pros and cons of every system because I would make the argument that it's very situational, right?
Yes, that is like, because we were saying like it's availability of kind of like resources, what's in demand, and then two, like, because we're talking about GDPs, like you could have a region that's massive with not a lot of stuff, like Siberia, right? Like this GDP of Siberia, like obviously, like yeah, there's resources there, but there's like a couple million people spread out over like an area the size of like several countries combined. So like, but then you have like a little area like in South Africa where it's like half of the world's diamonds come from. So it's that's why Siberia is a bad example because most of the diamonds.
I was going to say because Siberia is funny with that. They do have a lot of raw minerals.
Yeah,
and
terrible example, but yeah, you know what I mean. Yeah, like like the Mongolian desert.
Yeah. But no, I know what you're saying in the sense of right, like whether it be a certain industry or geographical like size of location, that will determine. Well, even in a larger scale, right? We talked about the difference of Ontario's GDP versus Saskatchewan's, right? Obviously, there's way more people in Ontario. There's way more like business and trade that happens in Ontario. So the GDP of Ontario is going to be a lot higher. But if you look at the GDP of Canada, if you live in Saskatchewan or you live in PEI, that gets lumped in, right? No different than any other country in the world, right? You can look at the United States and do that same example of, I don't know, you live in Vermont versus California. You're still all included in the U.S. GDP, right? The economy of the whole country. And I think that that's also really important because politicians talk a lot at the federal level, especially of the economy. They talk about it in all levels, but it's most important at federal because it really might not have anything to do with you, right? Like if the economy of the United States is going really well, that might not have anything to do with Vermont or I don't know. I'm picking on Vermont, but
or like two industries could be having a good year. And that's
kind
of props
like
it up.
Energy and tech are doing great. Well, if you don't have those,
it's not actually reflective 100%. Because you can have obviously like you said Vermont, but then you can go drive a few hours and there's like Ohio.
Sure. Yeah.
Like anywhere in Ohio. So it's just
and kind of I guess similar to what you're just saying now, but also it made me think of what you were saying earlier. The depending on what you're looking at from a regional standpoint, right? The economy of, let's say, Canada versus the economy of the United States, it also doesn't factor in how many people live in that area. So if you have a place that's very densely populated and has a, like, I don't know, a smaller GDP, or sorry, high GDP relative, like kind of on a per person level, but they might only relative to the United States, which is a very large a very large country with a large population. They're able to produce more, but maybe on a relative scale to just how many people that were really, like, if you boil it down to on a per person basis, a country like Singapore, right, is a good example. Or even like South Korea is another good example, where it has a large
Densely
economy
populated.
relative to the amount of people there.
Yeah, they're densely populated.
Versus, like,
areas,
you could make
like,
the argument that Canada, in some ways, is kind of worse than even some countries that have a lower GDP, because we are such a large country with not a ton of people, right? So in theory, right, like, we should be able to produce lots, and we are producing lots relative to some of these smaller economies of the world, but for us on an individual basis, that might not really add up to very much, right? Versus a small island somewhere might be able to actually produce quite a bit relative to the amount of people that are there.
It would be more like, it might filter down more to the individual when you're looking at, like, on a smaller scale, like, just, you're looking at, like, just like a county.
Yeah.
Or we have regions, like we were saying earlier, so, like, we're just looking at, so that might give you a little bit better of an idea.
Yeah, like, to get a better sense of really what it is. And I guess maybe just as a whole, it's really the fact of, you should question or think about what really are all the different pieces that add up to the statement of, hey, the economy is doing well, or hey, the economy is not doing well, right? Because is that as clear of a picture as it's trying to present itself as, right? Like, the economy often is looked at as inversely connected also with, like, a bit of, like, purchasing power in some ways. So a strong economy means that you're able to produce a lot, which means that you are able to purchase a lot, right? You can't produce a good, whatever that good may be, if you have no money in the first place, right? I can't build a TV if I don't have the resources to like buy the resources to make that TV in the first place, right? And on top of that, I can't really, even if I have the money for those goods, it may not necessarily mean that I can sell that product, right?
Sell them,
and that's where actually I think that, like, I'm glad that my mind even went to that, because it is interesting that you can have a GDP that's really high, right? AKA the revenue that we were able to bring in as a country or a province is massive, but that doesn't mean that it's all domestic, right? It could mean that maybe 100%, or I don't know, that might be extreme, but 100% of a certain good is exported. Because,
well, actually, it might know, because in some cases, it's 100. Like, there's some stuff you can only import, and there's some stuff like Like, I'm trying to think of a good example, but, like, I know in the States, like, they can't get Havana Club. My cousins always ask me.
Yeah, that's nice.
That's something they always ask me to bring for them.
Such a random thing to not have.
And I was like, country. I guess you guys in Cuba aren't always that cool, so. Like, that would make sense.
Yeah, I never really thought about that.
One of those weird things, right? You're like, I guess they wouldn't. Yeah. You're like, I'm like, that's such a weird request, but I was like, it makes sense. Like,
and so I think in some ways, going off of that, if you have a country that imports more than they export, your GDP is very low. right? Because even though you could be exporting a ton of stuff, that importing almost offsets it, right? Or I guess even maybe not even GDP is the best example, but the economy is not doing as strongly as it should be, because
we could look at like almost any of those little Pacific Island nations, right? Like they're not going to have, they have to import most of, you want to have like even like somewhat modern lifestyle, like you're going to have to import most of your stuff. Because other than like electricity and shelter, you're not going to have much else that's produced domestically.
Or like even kind of, if you aren't trying to be a traditional economy, right? Maybe you want a wider assortment of agricultural goods, right? So sure, you're producing, I don't know, maybe you have chickens there, but you want to get, I don't know, pigs or cows that you don't have domestically at a place. That's going to play into just how much is affecting your economy, right? Because if you're importing all these goods, that's benefiting the countries that are exporting it, but it's hindering your economy because now you're having to pay for that stuff rather than just domestically having it and trying to grow it yourself, so to speak. But yeah, I hope that as a whole kind of makes sense for just why we're having this conversation today about economics and economy, right? Knowing that you want to question it when you hear things, people talk about economy or economics of a certain thing, right? Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I was just saying about questioning.
So questioning why it is the way it is, and also just knowing that because there are so many factors that contribute to both this idea of understanding what your economy is like and understanding the economics of that economy, it's not always so clear cut of what's the right decision. Now, you can make a decision on an individual situation, right? You can say that, I don't know, arguably speaking, the drug prices of insulin in Canada are astronomically better than the insulin prices of the United States. Or the other big one was EpiPens. Like I remember watching like a news article talking about how like EpiPens were like the equivalent of, I don't know, like essentially free here, or like $10 here versus like $400 in the United States. That might be completely off on the terms of numbers, but you get the idea of something where, hey, the government stepped in. That was great. Like that technically is government control and oversight, which is sometimes looked at as a negative thing, working out positively.
Well, it can be negative or positive.
I'm sure that we could also point out some examples of when government has stepped in and regulated things.
Depends on who's making up your government. You can have the incompetent democracy and a competent authoritarian dictatorship. So like, it doesn't really. It just depends on who and how.
Yes. Yeah. It really is. Yeah. You can't just say it's a system issue, right? It's also an individual issue of.
Because who knows? Like, you can have certain states where, like, it makes sense to have free market on EpiPens. It's like a desert, so you're not going to have like people running into like allergies often. If you do, it's like, well, why do you live there?
Maybe.
Maybe you should consider moving then.
Maybe. Yeah.
I don't think it's the government's responsibility that you're very like prone to something. You decide to live somewhere where it's going to kill you.
Yeah, or just even the aspect of, I know insulin is manufactured, so that's maybe not a great example. But you can get it pretty cheap in some states. Here's a good example. In countries like Canada, we have a little bit more regulation on energy, right? In a country like maybe Saudi Arabia, when there is just an absolute excess of oil being produced, like they don't need to regulate it because it's so cheap. They just give the supply there for their citizens.
Which is right? It's funny because think here like we wouldn't need to regulate hydropower, but
well, that's because we do silly things like exporting our energy.
Yes,
right?
Yeah.
Like, and I guess maybe that also kind of comes back to things when governments or businesses, because they're both equally guilty of this. And again, maybe this is even getting to a larger conversation around globalization and stuff like that. But because products in our world today, products and services are essentially a business, whether it be energy or some other industry, if the intent behind it is to make as much profit as possible, you might not prioritize your domestic population, right? So I might not take my energy supply and say, okay, well, I'm going to make sure that the cost of energy in Canada is as low as possible because we have all this excess. Like, we have more than enough to run the country. Again, I've never looked into the numbers. Let's just say that that is the case, that we have a surplus of energy. Sometimes you might not actually have a surplus of energy, or maybe you do, but you sell or export more of that energy to other, like, I don't know, whatever, someplace in the United States that doesn't have a lot of energy sources is dying for this energy, this electricity to come in. So whatever, Ontario or Quebec or someplace exports that energy to that country or that state, rather than saying, okay, even in the rural parts of northern Ontario or Quebec, we're going to make sure you have everything you need. We're going to say, okay, well, I make more money exporting this than I do selling it domestically, right? Yeah. And that is, I guess, again, sometimes that conflicting aspect of planned/command economies versus market. In theory, a planned/command economy would prioritize its domestic population, right? Or it should. It doesn't always. You could argue that you could have a planned economy, like how you were mentioning, like with monarchies. In theory, maybe the monarchy controls everything. It's an authoritarian regime, but it doesn't care about whether its population reaps the benefit of its resources, right? Yeah. Maybe it's like, oh, if I sell it to this state over here, I'll make more money. So that's what we're going to do.
That's your typical Hollywood.
Yeah.
Some dictator on
100%, right?
Right.
Playing Tropico.
Send in the Expendables.
But yeah, right. In theory, though, you should have a planned economy or a command economy that does prioritize those things, right? Or even in the mixed scenario, right, where it is like sometimes the government is stepping in, that you are prioritizing getting that supply to your local population at as cheaply as possible because it's a necessity for them, rather than saying, okay, from a market standpoint, we'll sell this off and get as much as we can for it, right? But yeah, hopefully that all makes sense, right? Like, it is a way more complex than I think people make it out to be. It's not so black and white. I think sometimes also the terms economy versus economics get interchangeable. Like, even today in our episode, really traditional planned economies and market economies and mixed economies are not necessarily the economic system. It's the type of economy.
And the other thing is too is to take into that, if you're wondering why, like, you hear this, like, the GDP's gone up or whatever, but you're still paying way more than you used to for anything. It's then you can see where the dots are kind of connected.
Back to that economic system rather than the economy.
Yes, exactly.
No, I love that you brought that up, because it is. I think that that's such a relevant point to today, right? So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because we are living in the world of talking about inflation and all these things. Like, even unemployment is very low in countries like Canada or even the United States, I think. But yeah, the cost of goods is at all-time highs, right?
Back to the inflation,
right?
So
it's all those different pieces that play into it, and the combining of those two overarching things to really get a sense of, hey, where are we at? And then also, I think, arguably, how do you make it better or fix it, right? Depending on your scenario, because they both play into it, right?
Well,
equally. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add to this. It's definitely a relative to some of our episodes on the shorter end, but I think that is a good thing.
That was the last big point I had hanging off there.
That is perfect. I think that's a great way to end it. I think that gives people a good sense of what we're all talking about. So hopefully you guys have learned something. hopefully we didn't confuse you more than we explained to you. But yeah, at the end of the day, we hope that you take this information, build your own understanding, maybe go and do more research about all these things, have these conversations with other people, and together we can kind of grow our understanding of how our world works, and hopefully then you have a better sense of what our kind of new tomorrow may look like. But with that being said, I'm Braden. He's Jordan. We are the Realist Idealists, and this is Powerview.